Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Kopanis, and welcome to the inaugural episode of SOEN Live. We're coming out of the gates shooting for the stars with our first presentation. We are very, very fortunate, and I stress very fortunate, to have such a great presentation to offer you. A presentation that was never supposed to be. The fifth and closing keynote at CUSEC 2006 was scheduled to be given by one David Heinemeier Hansen of the Ruby on Rails fame. But due to a snowstorm, he was not able to make it to his presentation. We found this out at 5 p.m. on Friday, and David was scheduled to give a presentation on Saturday morning. Now, Chad Fowler gave the opening keynote for CUSEC, and since he's very involved in both the Ruby and Rails communities, and he's very hard at work writing a book entitled Rails Recipes, we thought, who better to give a presentation to young, passionate software engineers on the topic of Ruby and Rails than Chad? With a little coaxing by the organizers and over 300 attendees, Chad agreed to whip up a presentation in less than 12 hours. And let me tell you, it was a great presentation. I know all of you are here to listen to Chad Fowler's presentation entitled Rails is Boring and Ruby's a Toy. But if you can bear with me for a minute or two, I'd like to plug a couple of our other projects that we feel as a passionate software engineer you'd be very interested in. First off, CUSEC, the Canadian University Software Engineering Conference. If it was not for CUSEC, there would be no SOEN Live. The first 10 or more presentations that we'll be offering to you have been recorded this past January at CUSEC 2006. There was over 300 attendees at our last event. If you're passionate about software engineering, then you have no excuse for not being there. Make sure to check out CUSEC's website at woo.cusec.net. And while you're there, check out the archives of check out our archive section that lists all the amazing presentations that were given at CUSEC over the past 5 years. Secondly, SOEN.info. SOEN.info is another one of our projects with a lofty goal. This project goal is to help index all of the software engineering knowledge that's presently on the internet while helping people stay up to date. Check out www.soen.info and please get involved. Lastly, there's SOEN AI, or the Software Engineering Advancement Initiative, or in French, please don't laugh, Initiative pour l'avancement de génie logiciel. The initiative that is born out of CUSEC and is responsible for creating projects like this one and SOEN.info. We are always looking for ways to help support, educate, and bring together software engineers. So if you have any suggestions, don't hesitate to get in contact with us. And we're always looking for some very passionate software engineers to help volunteer. So again, don't hesitate to get in contact with us. You can contact us through soenai.com. Now, truth be told, you didn't subscribe or download this podcast to listen to me talk. You want to hear what Chad Fowler has to say. So without further ado, a teaser. Make sure to subscribe to our RSS feed if you want to be notified of when we post the other presentations by the likes of Kathy Sierra, Peter Gregano, and even Chad's other presentation. And also make sure to stay tuned to the end of Chad's presentation for our blooper reels. What is a good podcast without a blooper reel? And without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you the author of the book, My Job Went to India, and All I Got Was This Lousy Book, and the upcoming book, Rails Recipes. A very smart man, a good guy, and a good friend, Chad Fowler.
There's the part where I blow into the microphone, so they warned me that if I held the mic like this, I might end up blowing into it or breathing into it. So if it gets overbearing, just tell me. Well, as you know from my previous presentation, I am a jazz improviser. So today I'm going to attempt to exploit the skills of improvisation by doing a last-minute presentation on Rails. It is a sad thing that David Heinemeier Hansen couldn't be here today. He called me yesterday on my cell phone from Seattle and said, "Hey, do you have any Rails presentations you can give?" And I said, well, I have a 4-day training class, but I don't think that's appropriate for a keynote. But what I'm going to do is fit all of the slides of the 4-day training class into this hour and 15-minute presentation. So get ready. But seriously, I know David pretty well. We collaborate on a lot of things, and when he came into the Ruby community, I had already been involved in Ruby for a long time. I developed the package manager. I was one of a couple of people that developed the package manager that you use when you install Rails. And we sort of hit things off philosophically the package manager is called Ruby Gems, by the way. David and I really hit it off philosophically when he moved into the Rails community and quickly became friends. I haven't done a lot of Rails work until about 6 months ago. I started using Rails when it first came out, but I wasn't doing a lot of web application development. But I've been intrigued by the philosophy behind Rails. So what I'm going to do is some examples, but an hour and 45 minutes to master Ruby and Rails. So if you want to do the rest of the 30 minutes, we can like get together during lunch, and then you can reach mastery. The title of the presentation is Rails is Boring and Ruby is a Toy. I called the presentation this because I am an expert evangelist, and I co-founded Ruby Central, which is the equivalent of like the Perl Foundation, or I guess they have the Apache Foundation and the Python Foundation. I co-founded the Ruby equivalent, so part of the job of the Ruby equivalent is to evangelize Ruby. And I've been practicing for years, and I'm really, really good at it. So Rails is boring and Ruby is a toy. This is what I've learned over years of evangelizing. In terms of marketing speak, what do you think? Is that a pretty effective way to sell it? No. Good morning. So I'll tell you why Ruby is a toy. But I'll start by asking a question. First, I don't know if you like the word programmer. It seems like some people don't like that here. So engineer, whatever. Substitute the word you like. Who wants to be one of these? All right, why are the rest of you here? Why do you want to be that? It's fun. Well, I'm not going to ask anyone else then. Why use Ruby? The answer to that is the same as the answer to the why do you want to be a programmer question, because it's fun. This is a face, by the way. Notice the face. I made this presentation after Kathy's presentation yesterday, so I put a face in it. So yeah, programming is fun. Programming in Ruby is really fun. And when you talk to Ruby programmers and they say, well, why do you like Ruby? They say, because it's fun. And then the, like C++ people say, what? Doom is also fun. It's not as fun anymore because it's 2D. You can't look up and down. And after having played all the newer games, that actually starts to drive me crazy. It makes me sad. But Doom 3 is 3D, so it's still fun. I'm showing you this because if you remember my talk from whatever day that was, I talked about Doom and the passion that Doom infused in me and the need to create. And it was because Doom was exciting to me and fun. And, I talked about how Doom was like chess, and I think Kathy really had me pegged yesterday when she was talking about how people who are passionate about something always have some kind of metaphor. It's not just playing a stupid deathmatch game. It's like chess. It's this intellectual exercise. But that's what Doom was for me, and the passion of Doom made me a great programmer, or a good programmer. It made me want to be a great programmer. So the question is fun a good enough reason to explore a technology, or to learn a programming language, or to do anything that involves work? Because we're all here because we're going to school to learn to then go to work. And I was trained to think that work was not supposed to be fun. So to say that Ruby is fun, if I go to my bosses at GE many years ago and I say, well, let's use this technology, and they say, why? And I say, because it's fun. I don't think they would even respond to that, actually. They would be waiting for the actual answer. But is that a good enough reason? Actually, I should take a moment. I'm talking about Ruby and Rails. I'm hoping to keep things pretty high level and philosophical and kind of make you think a little bit. But it doesn't have to be about Ruby. It could be Python. It could be Scheme or Smalltalk. It probably couldn't be Java or C, but it might be. Depends on what year you're living in. But I don't want this to be there. Better? Was it distorting or something? Okay. Oh, blowing into it again. You were supposed to tell me. So don't take this as like this language advocacy rant where I'm trying to convert you all to Ruby. I really don't care if you get converted to Ruby, because at this point there's enough Ruby programmers, I think. Maybe this time last year there weren't, but now there's maybe a few too many. But I do want to show you what I love about Ruby and what I've learned from Ruby and from Rails, and hopefully have that infect the things that you do. So, back to fun. Is that a good enough reason to do something? Well, ignore the little text down there. I didn't have a good picture that I could find quickly enough, but you are better at doing things that you enjoy doing. If you think about it, like sometimes I mow the lawn at my house, and until recently I had a really big lawn. Do you say lawn here? Garden? Whatever. When I say that, I shouldn't say it in the present tense because I do such a bad job mowing the lawn that I'm not allowed to mow the lawn anymore. Because when I'm mowing the lawn, I'm just trying to get the damn lawn mowed so I can go do something like play Doom or, program in Ruby. I do a really poor job of mowing the lawn, and I care about it so little that I don't even notice that it's not a good job of having mowed the lawn. It's maybe rough, or I don't even know how you judge whether a lawn is well mowed because I don't care. But my wife notices, so she likes to mow the lawn instead of me. But the same is true for work assignments. Someone asked a question yesterday of Kathy. I'm doing some lame shopping cart thing for my university or something, and that's not very fun. So how do I get passionate about that? Part of the reason for driving passion is that it makes you have fun and it makes you pay more attention and you notice the details. It's that higher resolution experience that Kathy was talking about yesterday. You are better at doing things that you enjoy doing. And you have more fun doing the things that you're better at. So it becomes a cycle. I would have drawn a cycle, but I don't know how to do that with Keynote. But it's a circle, You enjoy it, you get better, that makes you enjoy it more. And you just go, you learn, and that makes you a more productive software developer. That's one of David Heinemeier Hanssen's things. I think if he were here, in fact he told me, he would have done a presentation where he talks about beauty equals happiness, happiness equals productivity, therefore beauty equals productivity or something. And I don't know if that made any sense to me, but it's kind of about this. It's about if you love to do something, you're going to do a better job at it. And as I said in my talk on Thursday, our jobs are to produce things of value. So the more fun you're having, ostensibly, the more value you're going to produce. So the answer to whether or not fun is a good enough reason to choose a technology might be yes. That doesn't mean that you can go and use this little argument at GE and say, or Microsoft or whoever you might go to work for and say, because it's fun, and here are the 3 bullet points that prove that point. That's not going to work. But for your own personal choices and your own career and your own development in the craft, it may be worth it. So changing gears a little bit, another sort of philosophical thing about Ruby and related languages and technologies. When you're writing code, who are you writing the code for? That's not a rhetorical question. Who has an answer? Yourself? Who else? The next poor guy that's got to read it, right? Not the computer, though. The computer is a secondary audience. But a lot of us, especially in universities, I think, we learn to write code for computers. And we learn about things like optimization. And we think about high-level languages, and you say, oh my God, how can that perform well? And in some cases, it's very important that it does perform well, embedded software, things like that. But when you're writing a web application, or some GUI application on, to be deployed onto a Macintosh or Windows machine, the primary audience of your code is the next person who has to read it. And sometimes the next person is you. I've written a lot of Perl code, and I go back a few months later and I don't understand what it means at all. And I have a really bad memory, so I might as well be a different person when I go and I look at my own code. So Ruby is really optimized, and this is actually Ruby's creator, Yukihiro Matsumoto. He optimizes Ruby for the humans that have to deal with Ruby. One optimization is the fun factor, because he understands that fun equals productivity, equals skill, et cetera, et cetera. And one optimization is the readability factor. So Ruby lets you do very little, and I'll show you some examples where other programming languages force you to do a lot to express the same concepts. That's one of the things when you talk to people who get into Ruby or Python, you say, why are you so interested in this? And they say, it's expressive and it gets out of your way. It's kind of like the featureitis thing Kathy was talking about. You don't always have the same amount of control, but you can do things much quicker. So speaking of optimization then, when you optimize your code, here's a very simplified view. You measure the code. Hopefully you measure it first. You find out what needs to be improved, and then you measure it again. And you do that until it's fast enough, right? Am I leaving out any important steps? No? So, take this idea of optimization and apply it to software development. Which one of these is faster? So the guy on the left, is he faster at processing things than my PowerBook? Of course not. And in fact, what's that? Don't contradict me. Okay, it's not necessarily true, but when it comes to optimizing for a computer versus optimizing for a human, think over the years about, Moore's law says roughly that computing power doubles every 18 months or so. I don't remember the exact quote, but that's basically what it is. And that has sort of held true. And even if it doesn't quite hold true, or it's only half true, think about how much software developer power has been increasing over the years. How much faster can I write a program this year than I could this time last year, or 18 months ago? I guarantee you it's not twice as fast, or even close to it. I'm a better software developer because I practice, but I don't get twice as fast. So if you go back and you look at this picture, and you're taking a data-driven approach, without actually doing a formal experiment, then you have to look at, it's the software developers that need to be optimized. And just to back it up a little bit, there's a really great talk that you can actually download. I think you can download the video and you can watch it, but there's this lightweight languages workshop that takes place at MIT. I didn't see it the last year. I don't know what happened to it, but in 2002, a researcher from Microsoft was there, and he was talking about problems in programming language design. And he had this wonderful quote on his slide, and he talked extensively about this. The most important open problem in programming languages, he says, the least important problem is compiler optimization. And the most important problem is increasing programmer productivity. Then he goes on to talk about all these business books, including Crossing the Chasm, which is a really great book in kind of a series of books about disruption in the marketplace, and specifically disruptive technologies. And he says that the things that are going to really innovate from this point forward in language designs are the things that most of the language researchers would laugh at and say are ridiculous. So he favors increasing programmer productivity above even doing things, quote unquote, right. So let me show you some examples from the Ruby world. The simplest Java program that I know how to write is Hello World. And to write that, since Java is supposedly object-oriented, you have to have a class, even though you don't need one. Now, I would argue that this is not actually object orientation. This is ridiculous class orientation and kind of lame design. But if you want to print the string hello world on the screen, you have to define a class, and you have to give it some name, even though you might never use the name. And then you have to define this public static void main method. And it has to accept parameters that you're not going to use, the args thing. Does anybody do Java programming in the room, by the way? Okay, good. Anybody do like servlet programming, J2EE type programming? Okay, good. And then you have to do system.out.println hello world, and you have to put the semicolon on the end. What is that for? Here's the equivalent Ruby version, and it would look very similar in Python or Perl. Now, as we heard yesterday, it's impossible to put a real program here. Dr. Gargano was talking about, we have to put things that will fit on the screen. But just look at the difference. The number of characters. I can't even count that many characters without wasting your time. Versus that. The number of buttons you have to hit. Now, if your job is to sit around all day and write programs, this adds up. It really does. And it adds up in terms of two things. One, the actual time that you have to spend touching the buttons. And if you don't type well, then that can really add up. The other is the amount of frustration and the amount of fun that is taken out of your work having to type public class, hello, blah, 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 blah. All this boilerplate crap that you wouldn't have to type if you used a different language. Or an IDE that automates it. I'm aware that, people are working around these shortcomings. Another example, and a source of debate and confusion and anger sometimes, and way too much text flowing through Usenet, is typing. So Java has strong static typing. And Ruby has not weak typing, nor does Smalltalk or any of these other languages that I'm talking about. Ruby has strong dynamic typing. And a lot of Java people, or even C++ people, or C# people, they look at Ruby and they say, oh my God, it's weak typed, and how can that be safe? But I won't go into that entire debate here, other than I want to say strong dynamic typing a few times. Strong dynamic typing, not weak typing. So you can argue against this, but don't call it weak typing because you'll show your ignorance. But typing ends up causing you to create a bunch of ridiculous code, like public date equals new date. And the pragmatic programmers have an often cited rule called the DRY principle, which stands for don't repeat yourself. Java kind of forces you to do that. And it's not just Java either. I should qualify that I know Java really well, and I've used Java a lot, so I'm picking on it for the examples. Really view this as any mainstream technology that makes you do this kind of thing. You can think about C#, you can think about C++, or even Ruby, the ridiculous things about Ruby. But my point here is, again, that the type checking makes you type a bunch of stuff. Checked exceptions make you type a bunch of stuff. And you end up wasting your time not creating the product, but creating a bunch of crap to make up for the things that the language forces you to do. So another big important thing that Ruby has going for it, but that people also complain about is, and they say it's a toy, there's no compiler, it's interpreted. It's like a real language person would do the interpreted version first as a prototype, and then they would create the compiler, and you would actually have a compiled language. But to those of us that use it, now I know you can do on-the-fly compilation and JIT and all that kind of stuff. There is no compile step. There's no makefile. There's no build.xml, if any of you have used the atrocity that is Ant. And there is no Maven, if any of you have. Surely you haven't used Maven. Anyone know what Maven is? One, okay, two. All right, don't learn. It's terrible. But it's what people are doing instead of Ant right now. It's like They didn't think Ant was bad enough, so they started using Maven instead. It's a bunch of XML files. So I just wanted to talk about this a little bit. This is sort of a tangent, but at dinner we were talking about it, and I thought it was very relevant to the discussion. There is definitely a need for people who do engineering in software. And I'm using not the term that is very popular here. You know, I said in my last presentation I was going to avoid discussing the fact that I hate the word engineer, because I know that it means something different here than it does in the United States. But the way I look at it, there are engineers that do software development, there are craftspeople that do software development, there are artists that do software development, and they're all different skills. There was recently a post by Joel Spolsky. I don't know if you all know Joel on software, but it caused a big stink. And part of the stink was on my weblog, where Joel was saying, I think the title of the post was The Perils of Java Schools. And his point was that universities start teaching Java in the schools instead of C or C++. They're dumbing down the curriculum. And, you know, we don't have the ability to separate the men from the boys, so to speak, which is his words, because we don't expose people to languages that require them to explicitly manipulate pointers and do recursion and things like this. And so he felt that that was a big problem and that we should be teaching people and forcing people to go through this lower level stuff as opposed to using languages that have garbage collection and do all these things for you. The disturbing thing about this, and what I think is very much at odds with the entire Ruby philosophy of human-oriented programming, is there are some people who will never make it past that point. Like, I am not an engineer, and I don't deserve to be called an engineer. I don't like dealing with C and pointers and all this hard stuff. I like making stuff. I like being creative. I like adding value. Some people like being creative and adding value, and they do the low-level stuff really well. So I'm not taking away from the whole idea of engineering and what that means in the Joel Spolsky sense. But my fear is that if this kind of an idea runs rampant, we're cutting out 2/3 of the population of potential software creators. And we're taking the people that could be making wonderful, innovative products in software, and we're saying, well, you're the boys. You don't get to play. You don't get to work for me. You don't get to make it through the computer science curriculum or the computer engineering curriculum because you're just not good enough. When actually, maybe languages like Ruby and Java, you know, we kind of put these together in this part of the discussion. Maybe they appeal to a type of person that would create something, but wouldn't have the interest or the ability to go down to the low level and deal with pointers. And they're more interested in choosing a tool that lets them, you know, create their masterpiece or whatever. So I wanted to go through this very briefly as sort of a tangent. So, and like I said, I'm not going to teach you Ruby here. I'll teach you in the 30 minutes after the talk. But you know, I'm talking about all these things about the Ruby way. And the question that I often get is, well, can I make a living doing that? And, well, I guess you can. I can. So maybe you can. But that's really very much beside the point. I learned Ruby 6 years ago when there was absolutely no way you could make a living doing it. And in fact, regardless of how good or bad it was, it truly was a toy at the time, a useful toy. But what happened to me, I was a very, very hardcore Java programmer at the time. I was really into the whole contract, static typing mindset of Java. You know, I'm sure you've learned about using static type checking to very clearly specify the interfaces between different objects in the Java world or the C# world, so that it's very clear like what can and can't go in and out of a method and that sort of thing. So when I started using Ruby, I loved the way it looked, and there was something that I couldn't really describe that made me really happy when I was using it. So I kept using it. But at the same time, I had this background in Java that really disturbed me because Ruby had this loose, dynamic kind of feeling to it. And I started learning all these different things that you can do with Ruby. Ruby has closure support. Do you learn about closures and continuations and things like that in your curriculum? Some people do. So Ruby has all this stuff that was invented in the 1960s and 70s, so it's cutting edge because most of us don't know what it is. But all this stuff that comes from Scheme and all these other giants before it. And I found that slowly, even though it bothered me that it didn't have the static type checking and some of the things I was used to with Java, I found that my Java programming activities started to get kind of frustrating. And I still loved Java at that time. I really was kind of a Java evangelist, But I started getting frustrated. I would hit walls and I would think, man, this is just not expressive, or this feels so clunky. And all of a sudden, Java didn't feel like the best way to do things anymore. That's because my mind was shifting and changing and evolving, and my thought process for programming was changing. And I was starting to see some of these potential Ruby solutions in my Java programs. And I would try to make them happen. I would hit a wall, like a language limitation in Java. But sometimes I would end up with some really interesting, elegant code, or really simple solutions in Java that came from my experience with Ruby. The pragmatic programmers, I talk about them a lot. They're friends of mine, and they're also big influencers of mine. But in their book, The Pragmatic Programmer, they recommend that you learn a different language every year. So I think I mentioned a couple of days ago, when I read the book, my language was going to be Ruby. So I'll learn Ruby this year. Unfortunately, then I stopped because I liked Ruby so much. But the idea is don't go from Java to C#. Because Java to C#, there's incremental differences. C# has attributes, well now Java has that. I don't know, they're kind of the same after Java 5. They're just kind of leapfrogging each other. But you're not going to learn a lot going from Java to C# or vice versa. Or VB or, even C++ or C. What you're going to learn from is Java to, say, Oz, or Ruby, or bfunge. Someone was talking about bfunge. Anyone played with that? I'm kind of joking about that one, but Smalltalk. Smalltalk is a great example. But anything that is sufficiently different, kind of follows a different paradigm. And I don't mean necessarily, although a good way to start is object-oriented, functional, very logic languages, that sort of thing. If you're doing one of those, then try doing a different one. Although I think you can probably go from, say, we were talking about the hybrid object-oriented to the pure object-oriented. That will cause you to sort of change the way you think about things. But I would recommend more like Java to Haskell. Because Haskell, you can't sit down and write a Haskell program and think in terms of the way you would approach the problem in Java. You just can't do it. You won't create a program if you try to do that. Haskell, has anyone tried Haskell? A few people, that's great. Haskell is a functional language and with a very interesting syntax, but the syntax is just, just syntax. It really makes you think about things differently. So my point is, don't just learn something because you can make a living doing it. You learn something because it will end up as a long-term investment changing your ability as, say, a Java programmer or a programmer in some mainstream technology where you can make some money. But most importantly, it will keep the passion going. It will keep you interested, and it will teach you things. So enough about Ruby. Ruby is a toy, as I said, and I mean that in the best possible sense of the word toy. It's a toy, and then it's something that you enjoy having. It makes you happy, fun to play with, educational, which toys tend to be. Rails, on the other hand, is boring. And this has been a theme that David Heinemeier Hansson has kind of emphasized from the start, and so have I when it comes to Rails. One of the best things about it is that it's really, really boring. So who knows what MVC stands for? Say it. Model View Controller. Do you know where model view controller comes from? What's that? Yeah, it's from the 70s. It's all the good stuff, the really innovative stuff, is from the 70s or the 60s or the 50s, I think. But it's a design pattern. It was created, I believe, as part of work in the small talk field, where a lot of really cool stuff was created, but I might be wrong about that. Yeah. And it was documented in the Design Patterns book that came out 10 years ago by the Gang of Four. And basically, it's a really good way to separate areas of concern in an application. So the very basic idea, and this is a picture of how it would work in a web application, is the model is supposed to represent like the business data of your application, if you're doing a businessy application. The view is what you present to the user, and the controller is ultimately just responsible for coordinating the model and the view, and for implementing application logic that involves those two pieces. So MVC is old news, as we've heard. It was created in the 70s, and it's really, 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 really boring. Starting in like 1999, MVC became a very popular pattern for web application frameworks. I was at GE at the time, and I created a really bad MVC Java framework that everybody in our division now uses still. There are hundreds of applications written with this horrid MVC application framework. At the same time, slowly, something called struts was being created. You know about struts? So, and now there are all kinds of alternatives. There are just hundreds of model view controller web application frameworks. So in 2004, David Heinemeier Hansen started instant messaging me, and I started seeing his posts on Ruby Forge and some of the sites. And he kept talking about the fact that he was making this MVC framework for Ruby, and it was going to change the world. And I thought, well, that's ridiculous, you know. It's an MVC framework. We don't need any more MVC frameworks. There are plenty of them, blah, blah, blah. But before he did that, he released a wiki. You know what a wiki is, right? So by the time he released a wiki, there were probably over 1,000 wiki implementations available for free. So again, I thought, what is wrong with this guy? He's got to be some kind of idiot. I mean, he's nice, so I'll keep talking to him, but he's got to be some kind of idiot. He's going to release a wiki and act like it's a big deal, and then he's going to release an MVC framework and act like it's a big deal. Blah, blah, blah. And I have these friends that are making these web application frameworks that are really innovative, and I truly believe that. Continuation-based stuff. Of course, Paul Graham was doing that a long time ago, but really, really interesting component-based, continuation-driven web application frameworks. So when I start hearing about this MVC thing, I'm just, you know, all right, well, let me know what it's out, and I'll pretend to have downloaded and looked at it and say, yeah, good job. So this in-sticky thing is what the wiki was. He released this wiki, and for some reason, it became the most popular Ruby application ever, which is not saying very much, because Ruby was a toy at the time. But it actually became very, very popular, and a lot of people started using it, and there were hundreds of thousands of downloads of this thing. Thankfully, using my Ruby Gems package management software, which helped to make my software more popular, which is good for the Ruby community. And then this Rails thing came out, and all of a sudden, everybody is talking about it. I showed up at the Ruby conference in 2004, right after it was released, and we always get together like the night before. You know, a few people come in early, we go for dinner, and everybody there was talking about how they just couldn't wait to meet this David Heinemeier Hansen guy, whatever his name is, because he's released this Rails thing, and they're really excited about it, and I was really shocked. But he ended up being like the rock star of the conference as a result for this MVC framework. The boring thing about Rails is actually what made it sell. Does that mean 30 in or 30 till? Okay, cool. And this turned out to be a key part of David's philosophy. He didn't want to freak people out with some innovative new thing. What he wanted to do was make people more productive, make people have more fun programming, take out all the crap that you shouldn't have to do, but to do it in such a way that it didn't feel like anything new, so there wasn't too much of a stretch, and that's what he did. That's why he chose the MVC model. So if you've used struts, or you've used Hibernate, which is a sort of a model layer thing in Java, or any of the ORM tools in Java, or probably C#, you probably have experienced that there's this big mass of configuration files. You do probably more XML programming than you do Java. So one of the central things behind what David was doing with Rails was to take all of that out and to do MVC, boring old MVC, totally unconfigurable, but totally fast. So I have spent hours of my life installing application frameworks and servlet containers and that kind of stuff. Literally hours of my life every time I try to do it. To install Rails, you type gem install Rails, and if you put -y, then you won't have to validate that you want dependencies. Literally, when you've done that, you're ready to run in production. So on a new production system, you type gem install Rails. Of course, you have to have Ruby with Ruby gems, but people who are doing Ruby development already have those usually. So this is the most boring installation that I've ever encountered. It used to be that when I wanted to install Tomcat with struts and Hibernate and all this stuff, I could pretty much sit down and guarantee that I could be sitting around listening to music for hours while I did this. And, I could spend a day where I could justify my time at work, and all I would have done by the end is to install the environment so that I could start working. So this installation, on the other hand, is completely non-eventful, and I find that to be very sad. So this is part of why Rails is boring. Now the setup process, this is really frustrating too. The next day would usually be spent with the Tomcat app doing the initial setup, right? So what is my directory structure going to look like? Which XML files do I have to have again? And I try to run it, and I get some big stack trace, and I read to the top, and I say, I forgot setup.xml this time, and then I forgot servlet.xml, and I forgot web.xml and hibernate.xml and my model.hbm.xml, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I need to find some examples of those files because I can't ever remember the syntax and the documentation is terrible. Rails, so once you've done, I'll go ahead and do one at the risk of making a real mess. I normally don't like to do live demos, but I'll make an exception for you. Do I have internet access? No? So I won't pretend to install it. Actually, I will. See how fast that went by? Okay, Rails is installed. So let's make an application called myCoolApp. I may already have one called myCoolApp, in which case it will be slightly less boring. No, I didn't. So you see it created a bunch of junk for me. Now that's kind of like one of these wizards that you have in Visual Studio, or I don't know if Borland still exists, but if they did, they'd have wizards too. And it's created this directory called myCoolApp, and here's all the stuff. And hey, myCoolApp is running. It's running on port 3000, I hope. Let's see. Yes, welcome aboard. So I won't show you all the details, but this is actually an application that I can now add code to. I think that's really fascinating because to me it's a lot easier to modify something than it is to create something from scratch. And I don't mean easier because the code is easier to read or whatever. I mean, I'm kind of lazy and I procrastinate. And if I have something that already runs, then I'm much more likely to keep working on it. So that's one of the things that Rails does for me. Go back here. We've done the boring setup. That was it. Just Rails, blah, you know. Yeah, it tells me I have to what? I have to edit my database.yaml. So let's look at that. I don't want you to think I'm trying to fool you. Here's what that looks like. Don't let it scare you. It has assumed that I have a development database called mycoolapp_development, and it's MySQL, which, hey, that happens to be true. So I'll create one. All right. So now it's right. I didn't actually have to do any configuration. I just had to create the database. Because on my sadly insecure laptop, you can log into MySQL as root with no password. But, you know, most people who do Rails development, that's also true of them too. Horrible, but, you know, what it means is none of us have to do any configuration when we install Rails. Saves a lot of time. So I made a database, mycoolapp_development. What if I want to access the database in some way that is useful? Well, here's all the code that's involved. Back in the Hibernate days, which is, you know, totally antiquated technology, which means cutting-edge Java technology today. Back in the Hibernate days, I would make a whole bunch of XML files, and I would have to figure out all this stuff about whether I want to do eager loading and blah, blah, blah. And yeah, that's good stuff to understand, but it's not good stuff to have to do every time you want to do something. So this is all of the code that I need to access a table called people and to associate it with a table called pets. So I'm modeling here that a person in my application can have many pets. So this is my pet tracking application, right? I'm sure that I will make a lot of money off of this in the Web 2.0 world. I'll go ahead and show you how to do that. So Rails has this generator thing. Can you read this? Otherwise, I'll say what it is. Can you read it on that side? Yeah? Okay, good. So I'll generate a model. Will I generate a model? Yeah, I'll do that first. Called person. Notice that there's all this test stuff. So it generated this Ruby file here. RB is the file extension for a Ruby file. It generated this unit test file, and it generated a fixtures thing that is for storing test data. It did all that for me. So when you look at the root of my application, I have a test directory in which I have a bunch of stuff that's kind of meaningfully named and gives me a hint of what I should do if I want to write unit tests. Not only that, I have this rake thing, which is kind of like make. I'm sure you all know what make is. And it comes preloaded with all these really neat little tasks. Let me find one here that's specifically interesting. Test units and test functional. So specifically test units. When I just generated this person model, it stuck stuff in that unit test directory. If I run rake test units, guess what it's going to do? It's going to run the unit tests that are all in there. So following convention, you end up saving a lot of time. So let me look at what I generated. Hey, that looks a lot like the screenshot that I had a minute ago, right? Except it's missing a word. All right. Now I will generate a pet, because we need a model for that. So I have person and I have pet. Now, what I'm ultimately going to be able to do is something like this. Person.find the person with ID 1, .pets.each do pet. So you want to be able to manipulate these things like this. So you have this really nice object-oriented API, and forget about the things that you don't understand that are Ruby specific. But basically what it means is that person.find call gives you an instance of a person on which you're calling the method pets, which gives you a list of the pets. And then you're calling each, which is an iterator that yields each pet, and then you can do something with it. And here I'm printing here pet, the name. So this is my goal. And now I have two files, person and pet. So let's make person look like it did in my screenshot. All right. So now person and pet are associated. The one thing that I haven't done yet is create a database table. But Rails gives me a way to do that too. I won't go into the details of what it means, but let's see. I'm going to create tables for people and pets. I'm generating something called a migration, which is a pure Ruby way of specifying your data schemas. I'll say I'll create a table called people. And in people, what does a person have other than pets? What do you want to know about them? Their name? What else? One more thing. Let's say age. What's that? Color. I'm not in the United States anymore, am I? I'll say integer, or age because it's an integer. I just want to show you that. And then I'll create another one. I'm sorry, I keep breathing into the microphone. Pets. And the pet, we know, has a name because I just pretended to reference it a minute ago. And it also has a person ID, which is an integer. This is a naming convention that is quite obvious when you start to use it, so I won't even explain it. Now that I've done that, I can type rake migrate, and hopefully I will have created the table in the database. Yes, I have. Now Rails comes with this lovely thing called the console, which I'm going to use. So I have a command line here. I can say person, that's a class. Person.class is class. Person.findAll, that's an empty set because I don't have any people. I've just created a table. What about person.create? Let me say person equals person.create. Name equals Chad. Age equals, how old am I? 20. So there I am. There's my person object. And I have a pet named Shrenik. So I'll say dog. I actually have 4 dogs, believe it or not. But 2 of them are Chihuahuas, so they don't count. Oh, sorry. Pet. Thank you. That's what I get for talking and typing at the same time. So now I have a person. Can you follow what I'm doing? It's fairly easy to follow, right? A person and a pet. And I can say person.name is Chad. Person.pets. I'm going to add to the person's pets the dog. Person.save. So now if I were to do person.find first .pets, I will see a list of the pets. So that's all the code. And if you come from an environment where you do Java stuff, I mean, imagine how fast I could have done that if I weren't talking at the same time. I do this every day, and it's just like, it's magic. You know, these applications spring from my forehead as if I'm Zeus. And it really is. It's magic. But it takes all of the fun of all this mapping and all these XML files and looking at Java stack traces, and it takes it all out and makes it very, very boring. So that's part of why Rails is boring. Now, if you wanted to create a controller, so the equivalent of a servlet or whatever they have in ASP land, say you wanted to have, you know, like my server /person/list, and you wanted to display a list of all of the people. And so this is the same code that I just created, right? Well, the controller part, and you remember from the model view controller list, it's that red thing in the middle. Person and pet are the model. The controller is in the middle. So we still aren't talking about how to view things. The controller code is literally just this. So the list action, business logic for it, you kind of saw because I gave it away when I was doing the console stuff. People equals person.find, that's it. That's the entire code. How do you map that URL to this action? Well, it's already done because of naming conventions, person, list. So we're done. And not surprisingly, Rails already has a generator for that. So most of that code you don't actually have to write. Generate a controller called person. Notice that it creates some functional tests for us there too. And it actually has like some test assertions, so you can run it and you can see like test truth worked or whatever. And we'll look at what was generated. And thankfully, it looks like the example basically that I did. So we could do list people equals person.find all. And we have now implemented the business logic to show a list of people in a database application. Just cheating a minute, I will, let's see, what's the best way to do this? I will attempt to render the list in some way that we can read it. So I won't explain what this means, but it's probably pretty obvious. Render the text. I'll start the server and see if we can actually see this. Again, the perils of live demos. But there it is. So you can see this kind of ugly representation. All that we're missing now is a view. Now, I didn't give you an example of a view, but a view is basically an HTML file. Has anyone seen like PHP, JSP, ASP? They all have this little ugly HTML-ish kind of syntax that says insert a value here, right? So we have the exact same thing in Rails. I won't bother demonstrating it, but to add a view, all we really need is an HTML file with a couple of those tags in it. So another 15 seconds, and we would have something that looks slightly nicer than that. So who saw the Ajax talk yesterday? That's pretty neat stuff, right? Does anyone not know what Ajax is if you didn't go to the talk? You never want to ask that question because everyone's like, oh, I don't know what it is. But it's a name for a technique for using JavaScript and asynchronous requests back to the server from the browser to do things that previously weren't normal in web applications. So if you've done like Google Maps or Gmail or any of those kinds of apps, they act like a rich application almost, because when you click this thing, the page doesn't refresh, but this, things start popping up all over the place. With Rails, well, the Ajax world was kind of, a lot of the Ajax world right now is riding on top of a library called Prototype, which is a JavaScript library. And Prototype changes the way you do JavaScript programming. It lets you do class-based JavaScript programming, and it makes a lot of things really easy. It also handles a lot of the details, the messy details of doing these XML HTTP requests, which is the asynchronous communication mechanism between the server and the browser. Prototype was created by one of the guys who works on Rails. And another very, very popular library that works on top of Prototype that does all these amazing effects, like fading things on the screen and replacing bits on the screen and that sort of stuff, is also one of the Rails core committer people. So as they work on these fancy JavaScript things that are leading the industry, they're also creating Rails helpers for everything. So the first thing that they did was when you create a link in Rails, you use a method called link2, and it generates links to your controllers and actions, which is what the names of the methods are. It just automates things and makes it easier. So they created this method called link2remote, which says basically it's the exact same thing, but instead of refreshing the page, they generate all this nasty JavaScript that you otherwise would have had to type in yourself that does an XML HTTP request for you. So in short, with lines as simple as this one line here, that's really two lines, but only because it wouldn't fit on the slide. But with lines like this, you can make these amazing effects that, kind of make your app look like Gmail. Here's a more detailed example that I stole, but it shows something that goes even farther. When you make the request back to the browser, you can create a view that instead of being that HTML I was telling you about is called an RJS view, and that's the thing at the bottom here. RJS stands for Remote JavaScript. What it does is it generates a bunch of nasty JavaScript again for you that does stuff like replace. So this is page.replace HTML sidebar with this partial view called sidebar. Sidebar is the ID. If any of you do HTML stuff, it's the ID of the element in the DOM that you want to replace on the client browser with the contents of the probably HTML snippet that we have called sidebar. And then page.visualEffect shake comment entry. What that's going to do is actually grab the thing with the DOM ID, comment entry, and it's going to make this really neat shake effect that would probably take you hundreds of lines of JavaScript to do. So again, doing stuff with Ajax and Rails is just simpler and simpler by the day, and there's no easier way to do it than in the Rails world. I'm not trying to sell Rails to you as much here as I am to talk about the fact that if you're doing things in .NET or whatever, or PHP, there are really nice libraries to help you do them. Prototype is a really nice library, and you can use that no matter what technology you're using on the back end. But why spend all that time writing all that code that you don't like to write? Why write all that JavaScript by hand, the hundreds of lines that it would take to do this, when you could just do it like this? And I'm not saying switch to Rails. What I'm saying is don't accept that in whatever language you're using or whatever technology you're using, because there is an easier way. This is proof that in this case there is an easier way. But there's also the general statement to be made that there is an easier way. So coming out of the technical examples again for a moment, maybe for the rest of the time, I want to talk about some of the principles that drive Rails that you can apply to anything, including some of the nastiest of Java environments. The big thing that I take away from Rails, and this is a phrase that's coined by David Hansen, is that Rails is powered by convention over configuration as a philosophy. So, for example, I'll just go back to it, this slide. Person list, the URL mapping, all that stuff. Typically in the servlet world or in any other world, if you wanted a nice URL like that, you would have to do some kind of mapping to make that URL happen. Here it's just naming conventions, and lots of things are driven by naming conventions. For example, you probably noticed when I went into the console and I referenced person, whether you're a Ruby programmer or not, I didn't have to say load the file called person.rb. So in Java that's import, and in C# it's like using or something like that. And in PHP it's include, right? I didn't have to do that because that's just an extra piece of crap that I would have to type that doesn't actually help me make my application. So how did I not have to do it? Well, Rails has implemented something that uses the convention of having app/models/person.rb mean there is a class called capital person defined in that file. And if I reference that class, it will automatically load that file for me. So it's another case of convention over configuration. Now, a lot of people get really angry about convention over configuration. And thankfully, Kathy's slides or Kathy's images are all Creative Commons, so you can use them like this without making her mad. But, she showed us this picture yesterday. I'm sure you remember. And here she's talking about passion. She's saying if you try to appeal to everyone and you're in the middle, it's a bad thing because you'll end up with a mediocre product, right? Well, I have worked for a lot of enterprise kind of companies, and the enterprise people and the enterprise mindset is all about being able to configure everything. So they think Rails is a toy because you can't configure it. It doesn't have all these XML files. The truth is you actually can configure it to some extent. But there's a flip side. There's a battle that we as enterprise people always fought, and that is consistency in our applications and maintainability across our portfolio. You know, I told you that I developed this app framework that hundreds of applications were developed with. What that tells you is that I was dealing with hundreds of applications. It's insane, and I mean like 900 applications when I was leading application architecture for this company. So 900 different applications developed by different people all throughout the world. If you're a developer on one and you go to another one, it doesn't look anything like the one that you were just on. And that's something that we really battled with, you know, at even like the level of our CIO, who is fairly clueless about these kinds of things, because it costs money to maintain these things. So the enterprise shoots itself in the foot by demanding configuration, when really the idea of convention over configuration is more suitable for the enterprise. They just don't know it. They don't get it. So this picture applies to them too, where if you're on either end of this thing, you're probably going to end up with something more maintainable as well as something that people are more passionate about. The same picture applies to something that David Hansen annoys people with, which is his notion of opinionated software. Here it really is about the passion thing, because I told you MVC is boring, right? And it's old news, and how could you really make a splash with MVC? And the way he's done it is he's made this thing so opinionated in his words that you can't ignore it. You either hate it or you love it, but everybody talks about it once they're exposed to it. A lot of people talk about how they hate it, and then the people who drink the Kool-Aid talk about how they love it, and the people that hate it are stupid. But it's this whole idea of, you know, he has opinions about how software should be developed, and he forces them on you. Now, I showed you that we were generating these tests, and we were generating fixtures, and really we were generating this entire application. There's a doc directory, there's a place to put components. It's already automated. There's already a way to do things like freeze the version and source control. All this stuff just from typing Rails my cool app. That saved me a lot of time, yes. But another thing it did that's a lot more subtle is it set things up in a way that it's really easy for me to keep doing stuff right. So if I type rake test units right now, some unit tests will run. It's really, really easy for me to go modify them. Oh, I didn't create my test database, but it's really, really easy for me to go modify those unit tests now and add my own assertions and my own business logic to them and continue to do that. And not only that, there are functional tests and there are fixtures for populating the application with test data that I can actually run these automated unit tests against. Testing is a very, very important thing to do. Most of us don't do it well. In fact, most of us don't do it at all. And the thing that we call testing is either waiting for the software testing people to click on stuff for us and make some reports, or we make some system.out.println crap at the end of our app and have it print, you know, some expected value. That's called the guru reads the output method of testing. The concept of broken windows. There are studies that have shown, and there are so many different places where it applies, that, like I read in The Tipping Point, the Malcolm Gladwell book that Kathy was talking about yesterday, there was a study done in some urban neighborhood where they took a really nice car and they sat it in the street for some period of time. And it was a very crime-ridden neighborhood. And that car sat there for a long time. And it was not tampered with. Then they took the same car, and I think they did this, scientifically, so it's not just one instance of each, and they smashed out one of the side windows. And within 2 days, the car was completely stripped of all valuable parts. The idea is this car was already messed up. Wrong had already been done. And when people see that wrong has already been done, they continue to do wrong. But when they see something pristine, they don't want to mess it up. The same is true in apartment buildings, in the New York subway. There's this big thing where the chief of police of New York completely turned crime around by just painting over graffiti in the subways. It's this broken windows principle. What Rails does by generating all these tests for you and on this wonderful structure for you, it's not just boilerplate crap to save you time from typing. It actually sets things up in this opinionated way to tell you, here is a trick, here's a hint. I want you to write tests because writing tests is good. And by the way, it's really easy, and here's some examples. So that's an important part of the Rails philosophy. The most important thing that you should learn from Rails, other than, actually learning Rails and doing stuff with it, is to ask why. And particularly in this case, it's why does application development have to be so hard? Why do I have to type all this code that has nothing to do with the application I'm trying to write? Why is there no easy way for me to make my batch programs? Why does embedded software have to be so hard? Even some of the areas where you don't think these kind of lightweight techniques can apply. Because that's what David Heinemeier Hansson did. And, he won Best Hacker of the Year from Google and O'Reilly last year, and he's suddenly famous, and people are building lots of software with this really, really boring, uninteresting model view controller framework, old news, because he asked repeatedly, why does it have to be so lame? This is the answer to why. Someone didn't recognize this yesterday, but this is a picture that depicts lemmings. You know what lemmings are? I don't actually even know, but there's this game where, the idea is they all follow each other and then they fall off a cliff. But people are like lemmings, and the industry is like lemmings, and everyone's just following the same path without asking why enough. So another great question to ask is why do Rails applications have to be so hard to develop? All that stuff I showed you just now, why should I have to type all that? Everything that I just went through, I didn't create very much business value in the course of this presentation. Why not? And this year, this is the question that David and the Rails core team is going to be asking. And we already have working code actually, that's going to make all this Rails stuff that is so far ahead of what you would have to do in something like struts, it's going to make it look ridiculous. And people will be making fun of this stuff this time next year. So continue to ask why. And I was really pleased with Dr. Gargano's presentation yesterday. One of the most important things to me that happened was that he showed that all these mainstream technologies that we're trained to believe are the way are really not very advanced and not very great. And, all this stuff was done better in the 70s. So question the technologies that you're using, even if they're the ones like this that I'm telling you are the cutting edge. Now, I didn't teach you much, so I'll show you the 3 books that you need if you want to learn Rails. Programming Ruby is the Ruby Bible. It happens to be by the Pragmatic Programmers. It happens to have my name on it, but, I don't deserve for it to have my name on it. I wrote a chapter about Ruby gems, so I don't get much credit. Agile Web Development with Rails. Again, just a wonderful book. These authors are fantastic. It's the Pragmatic Programmers again. And then Rails Recipes. Beta early February. Would have been a day earlier if I wasn't making this presentation last night. But this will be sort of a step-by-step cookbook style application that tells you how to make Rails applications, specifically things like Ajax and whatever. And I don't feel too bad about plugging it since I'm doing an extra presentation. The last thing I want to say The Ruby way is also very strong. It's a bit outdated, but he's working on the second edition of it right now. So when the Ruby way comes out again, that's a really great book too. Rails is too easy not to try. And by try, I mean literally 2 hours. So everybody who hasn't tried it yet that's in this room, over the next week, I challenge you to go download Ruby, go to rubyforge.org, that's the best place to do it, and to spend 2 hours getting Ruby, let's say MySQL, because that's easy to do, Ruby gems and Rails going, and go through a simple tutorial. And it will change the way you look at the way you do coding in whatever environment you're going to be doing it in, whether it be Ruby or not. Do that for yourself, because in 2 hours you will be amazed what you can do. And I'm cheating when I say 2 hours, because it'll end up being 8 hours whether you like it or not, because it'll be so much fun. But please, every single person here, 100% participation. Go try this if you haven't done it yet. And send me an email, chad@chadfowler.com, very easy to remember. Send me an email and tell me how it went, especially if you hated it for some reason. I'd love to know that. But do keep in touch and do tell me how it goes. And with that, I'm finished with the babbling part. And if you want, we can move to questions. Thanks.
I'd like to thank Chad for showing us how the board rails in. Thank you for my discussion today. Thanks, Chad.
Thank you. This was some really cool stuff. I really plan on trying it out, but only when my boss pays me for it. I have 2 questions here. You showed us some cool stuff that does monkey work and all that. But when it comes to real programming, what does it look like? Do you have any examples with you of some more complex logic or?
Yeah, I can show you some. Let's wait, and when we're done with the presentation, I'll just show some examples of real apps that I'm working on the screen if you want.
Okay. And I have another question.
Okay.
How can it integrate with other applications? We already have an infrastructure with quite a lot of PHP and other languages. Let's say we all want to run this on a single machine. Is this really possible? Can we work on the same database without messing things up?
Yeah, it's kind of 2 questions, right? One is how can you integrate? And the answer to that could be you can use web services. There's really nice, easy to use web services stuff in Rails and in Ruby in general. There are various YAML type protocols. There's all kinds of different ways built into both Ruby and PHP, for example, that you could use to communicate. But yeah, there's no reason that you can't co-locate a Rails application or a Ruby application on a machine that has PHP and access the same database. The only thing you would run into potentially, unless you're using transactions on the database, is accessing 2 things at once.
Okay.
Almost in a related note, I have several people asking me to install Ruby on Rails on my server so they could run apps on that. So it's very popular, and I'm getting harassed a lot. But I'm concerned. A lot of people said there's a lot of performance hits on a server, and Java uses up a lot of memory when you run that for servlets. But it doesn't use up much CPU. I was told that the Rails, when it's running on your server, takes a bit of CPU. Do you have any?
Well, my experience with that is that the footprint of a Rails app and the footprint of, say, Tomcat are pretty much equivalent. That's what I've seen.
And CPU usage?
Right.
That include? Okay.
That's what I mean. The overall footprint.
RJS was really cool. Is that documented? Because I've been looking for some and I didn't find any.
It is documented in my book that's not released yet. And it's documented in the training materials that I'm giving in London next month. But no, it's not. It's not part of Rails 1.0, and that's a good point that you brought up. Rails 1.0 is the official release. Since I work on Rails internals on occasion, I run off of the trunk So I actually check out the latest code of Rails every time I update my application. So I'm using features that don't exist in the 1.0 release. But there is a plugin for RJS that you can install. But there is not very much documentation at all yet. If you search like on Technorati, you'll find a couple of weblog posts that are really good for getting started. Any more questions?
A long way. Anyhow, the Rails ideas in putting all your test cases together and making it easy to get all the applications together. That's a pretty strong philosophy there. I like that. But it's right now it's only applied to Ruby. So any plans to expand to other languages in that? Java, we have integrated development, that's great. But
right. Well, that's a good question. In fact, something that I wanted to talk about. Not exactly the answer to your question. There are a lot of people cloning Rails right now in various languages. And then there's something called Django and Python, which is not actually a clone of Rails, but it's another sort of similar, really good web application framework. It's just, it hasn't got the market share because the guy who wrote it is not as good at marketing as David Hansen. But that being said, say you're doing an application with a WebSphere or with BEA WebLogic. Why couldn't you set up a framework like this so that you generate new things and they set things up like this for you? I don't know of anyone who's doing it, but you could write something in Ruby really easily. In fact, you could use the Rails generator code, write something in Ruby, and auto-generate all these Java things for you. So that's a great idea, and that's something to take away. Even if you can't use Ruby, you can use these philosophical principles, and you can make your work environment better.
And my friends, that is the end of the inaugural episode of SON Live. If you loved Chad Fowler's presentation, I'm sure you will love all the other presentations that we have in the pipeline. To keep up to date with all our presentations, make sure to sign up to our RSS feed at sonlive.com. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the CUSEC team for putting together a great